In 1901, it became illegal for children to drink alcohol. In 1929, the UK banned marriage for anybody under the age of 16. In 1933, we saw fit to outlaw child labour. In 1969, it was no longer legal to tattoo a minor. And this year, the government decided cosmetic procedures should not be carried out on anybody who was not an adult in the eyes of the law. So how on earth did it become possible for an NHS centre to give children hormones that would change their bodies irreversibly? Medical treatments based upon extremely dramatic decisions made by children on their growing bodies. How could it ever be right to encourage a child to have any life-changing medical procedure based upon dangerously dubious quackery on gender identity? For many, the decision to close the controversial Tavistock Clinic's Child Gender Identity Service has come far too late, with the sanctioned mutilation of often vulnerable children based on the fetishes and fancies of niche adult ideology, a horrific and unforgivably bleak moment in 21st century history. Well, joining me now to discuss the clinic's closure is Sinead Watson, who originally underwent medical transition between 2015 and 2019 before recently detransitioning. And we're also joined by Stella O'Malley, psychotherapist and founder of GenSpect, an alliance of professionals, parents, trans people, detransitioners who advocate for a better model of care. I'm going to start with you, Sinead. I mean, do you welcome this news that that clinic has been shut down?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my only problem with it was that it wasn't shut down earlier. We've actually known that these concerns stretch back many years. You can go back to 2005, and there were concerns being raised about the lack of safeguards there for children. So it simply couldn't have come soon enough. But the fact that it's finally happened is very welcome news.
Can you sort of briefly summarise what you went through in all of this? Because you transitioned and down the line said, this was a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go through the Tavistock, but I did go through a gender clinic up here in Glasgow. And unfortunately, my story won't be news to anyone who's looked into the Tavistock. You know, the issue that I had was completely overlooked in favour of affirming the trans identity. You know, I was suffering from depression and from various issues, but the second that you put gender on the table, those were ignored, and I was just affirmed. I was a trans man, I was beautiful and brave and all the rest of it. And when you listen to, for example, the CQC report that was on the Tavistock, they would say the same thing, that many of these children had autism or internal phobia or histories of trauma or eating disorder. It was all ignored in favour of unquestioning affirmation. It's ridiculous.
I mean, Stella, it's alarming, isn't it, that instead of looking at a complex Venn diagram of other disorders that may be the backdrop to a child thinking that they're not in the right body, there were people sanctioned to go ahead and begin processes on children that are irreversible.
Yeah, I think it's so awful that lots of people didn't believe really that it was happening, because they thought if that's happening, then we kind of can't trust lots of things in society. And they're right, it is awful. It feels like it's been a collective lobotomy from psychologists, doctors, clinicians who should have been looking after children, whose, you know, first principle of first do no harm never went away. And yet a lot of people, and a lot of people that I work with in GenSpect, are like Sinead. They've been impacted in a very devastating way by gender ideology and by this idea that, like Dr. Hilary Katz mentioned, an overshadowing of diagnostics happened, where lots of other issues like autism and ASD and ADHD and mental trauma were dismissed in favour of let's medically transition this child because she says or he says he wants it. And it feels it's too heavy a burden to put on children to be able to declare their medical pathway when there should be experts who are really responsible because they've studied for many, many years to get into that role of responsibility, that they take the responsibility seriously and they meet their responsibilities by making sure that they don't damage vulnerable people.
Sinead, coming back to you, how difficult has it been for you? And is it still, having transitioned and now detransitioned? I mean, what on earth is that like?
I wish I could describe it in a short way, but that I don't think that would be possible. So to boil it down as simply as I can, you'll never get over it. It's something that you carry, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. You can get to a stage where you can learn to manage, so insofar as you can say, well, no, I'm not dead, I'm still here, I can still live my life. But the fact that, the Tavistock deals in children. I was an adult when I transitioned, and it's still so horribly impacted my life for until the day that I die. The physical changes, the psychological changes, if it can have this effect on grown adults, how could we conceive doing this to children?
And Stella, finally, I mean, I want to talk about rapid onset dysphoria, which is something that people are talking about because the number of girls presenting to clinics has dramatically gone up. They used to make a very small proportion of young people thinking they were born in the wrong bodies, and now the vast majority. But the problem with this, I think it's denied by a lot of people who back the idea of giving children hormone blockers and interventions, is that it flies in the face of the idea that gender identity is somehow innate.
Yeah, there's a huge kind of controversy over whether gender identity is within me. It's very like the Catholic soul. I'm a Catholic, where it's well, I was baptized one, where it's this kind of identity within you that's unfalsifiable, it's unprovable. Nobody can put their hand on it. Nobody can test whether you have it or not. But if somebody says they have it, they have it. Versus people like myself, I'm a psychotherapist who has a developmental understanding of gender dysphoria, where sometimes because of maybe a biological kind of influx of hormones, or maybe a kind of psychological past experiences, or there's various different understandings of why you might suddenly think, I don't want to be the sex that I am. I want to be a boy, or I want to be a girl, or whatever. And so because of this controversy, that's fine. Doctors often disagree about lots of different things. What happened in this case was activists started leading the way, and activists have shaped the clinical model of the Tavistock, and it didn't go very well. And that spread out to lots of different other clinics all over the world. And, it has really impacted people in a devastating manner. And Sinead is very brave to kind of put herself forward and to speak and to talk about it. And, it feels very, very inappropriate that we need people like Sinead to speak up because the clinicians weren't doing their job, because they got caught up in an ideological mindset of a belief of something that's within you, rather than a general conventional understanding of there's lots of ways to express your distress. Some people express their distress with anorexia. Some people just express it with, OCD. There's lots of different ways, and we're never quite sure where these things come from. Nobody has the kind of secret to any sort of mental distress and say, this is why it's happening. However, what we do have is a lot of history, of training, of understanding that the holistic view of the individual is the most appropriate, that we go slowly, we go cautiously, we don't go fast, and we certainly don't give irreversible medical interventions to children when we can avoid it.
Sinead Watson and Stella O'Malley, thank you so much for coming on the programme today and explaining with such lucidity the abhorrency of, frankly, what's been going on in that clinic. Well, I'm going to now put this to we're going to put this to Emily in a minute, just finding out. Well, here we go. That's what I was looking for. The statement. In a statement, the Tavistock and Portsmouth NHS Foundation Trust has said this level of need cannot and should not be met by a single highly specialist national service. Really answering the question there, aren't you? It is crucial that gender diverse children and young people can access care and support in a timely fashion within a joined-up system. We'll work closely with our partners and commissioners to ensure a smooth transition, mind the pun, to the new model of delivery. Over the last couple of years, our staff in GIDS have worked tirelessly and under intense scrutiny in a difficult climate. Well, not exactly taking much responsibility. Now, in response to the Dr. Cass review, NHS England said this latest advice means we are now able to start building a more resilient service by expanding provision and enhancing the focus on quality in terms of clinical effectiveness, safety and patient experience. None of that seems to reassure me at all. Now, Emily, this just reminds me of, in the Victorian era, some wise egg decided having lobotomies might cure depression. In some, particular tribes in other countries, people think that FGM is a good idea based on quackery about female hygiene. And in this country, we're messing with little children's bodies with long-term ramifications based upon some adult hocus-pocus that gender is some sort of innate belief. These people should be in prison, surely.
I know, I do think that this is one of, if not the biggest scandals of our time. The fact that children are being pushed to believe that they can change their gender, and it's usually, from what I've read, young people who are either autistic or who have severe mental health problems, and they're being pushed in this direction for some reason, and it's pushed by an ideology that people can somehow change their gender and that is the solution to their problems. And it reminds me of when I was back at school, at a high-achieving girls' school. It was eating disorders that was what affected a lot of the girls at the school in terms of their mental health, and that was how it came out. That was the symptom. That it was by controlling eating. And I do think that perhaps the girls at my school now, I wonder how many of them are thinking that this is the answer, because when I was going through puberty, I did not want to show any signs of being a woman. I wanted to cover up any, burgeoning curves I had. I didn't want to be a woman yet. And if you're taught then that, to avoid the male gaze or to not have to grow up to be a woman and all that comes with that, the periods, etc., that perhaps you can be a boy instead, that might be appealing to a young girl who's scared of growing up and who may have underlying mental health issues. It
strikes me as well that, everyone knows that the female of the species is far more predisposed to community hysteria, like you were saying, things like eating disorders. Tourette's has been something which is breaking out among lots of girls who are looking at videos online and so on and so forth. And today, young girls are pressurised to having to conform to beauty standards that, they're beyond. You can't even, unless you have surgeries, you can't look like that. And
but also,
sure that's a big motivating factor.
Since when did adults listen to what a child is saying and assume that that is going to be their belief for the rest of their lives? It's people said, when children pretend to be an animal or they pretend to be, a princess, doesn't mean that they are that thing. People go through, you can allow a child to explore with how they present themselves, what clothes they wear. They don't all have to be wearing dresses if they're female and wearing cargo pants if they're a boy. Allow children to explore. And it's actually that, we're looking more at stereotypes when we're looking at this transitioning, aren't we? Because if you transition to a woman, you end up, you've got the very female stereotype is what you see yourself depicted as, a lot of these people who transition. But I just think it's so concerning because it is in our schools. It's in some of our curriculum and PSHE lessons. And I'm sure there are, there may well be a number of children who have severe gender dysphoria and that needs to be dealt with. But, mutilating young girls and boys is something that we will look back on with horror, I'm sure.
I'm absolutely certain.